The winter assembly at Blackthorn Hall glittered with such impossible brilliance that strangers might have mistaken it for a celebration of love instead of its quiet funeral. Crystal chandeliers scattered rivers of golden light across polished marble floors, while an orchestra coaxed graceful waltzes from polished violins beneath painted ceilings where angels forever smiled upon mortal vanity. Ladies in silk gowns drifted like blossoms through the ballroom, jeweled fans concealing eager whispers, and gentlemen in immaculate evening coats lifted crystal glasses as though nothing in the world could disturb the perfect order of English society. Yet beneath the perfume of roses and beeswax candles lingered another fragrance entirely, one composed of curiosity, ambition, and the delicious expectation of scandal. Every eye eventually settled upon the broad staircase, where His Grace Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe descended with the measured confidence of a man accustomed to commanding both Parliament and drawing-rooms alike. Tall, impeccably dressed, and devastatingly reserved, he possessed the kind of dignity that discouraged familiarity while inspiring admiration. Beside the staircase waited Lady Celeste Whitmore, elegant in sapphire silk, her composed smile inviting endless speculation among those who believed they understood the private affections of great families. More than one guest quietly predicted that tonight would finally free the Duke from a marriage everyone insisted had failed long before either husband or wife admitted it. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe entered only moments later, and conversation softened into uneasy silence. Her silver gown shimmered beneath the candlelight like moonlight resting upon fresh snow, while a single string of pearls adorned her graceful neck with restrained refinement rather than extravagant display. She neither hurried nor hesitated, carrying herself with the serene composure of a woman who had learned that dignity often demanded silence instead of explanation. Few noticed the faint exhaustion beneath her calm expression, or the way her gloved fingers briefly tightened around the delicate folds of her skirt before she joined her husband beneath the towering Christmas garlands. Nathaniel acknowledged her with a courteous inclination of his head rather than the warmth expected between husband and wife. The gesture lasted scarcely a heartbeat, yet it widened the invisible distance separating them more effectively than harsh words ever could. Eleanor answered with equal politeness, neither pleading for affection nor protesting the coolness that had become their daily language. Months of restrained conversations, unanswered letters, and carefully misunderstood intentions had built walls no architect could have designed more perfectly. When the orchestra fell silent, the family solicitor stepped forward carrying a polished mahogany case. Murmurs spread through the ballroom like wind across dry leaves. Nathaniel accepted several folded documents before addressing the assembly in a steady voice devoid of visible emotion. "Our families joined our lives with honorable intentions," he declared. "Regrettably, duty alone cannot sustain a marriage emptied of mutual happiness. Lady Eleanor and I have therefore agreed to seek its lawful annulment." Gasps rippled through the gathering despite everyone's anticipation. Noble women lowered their fans only enough to exchange astonished glances, while ambitious gentlemen silently calculated what such a separation might mean for fortunes, alliances, and inheritance. Every curious eye turned toward Eleanor, waiting for tears, outrage, or desperate resistance. Instead, she simply accepted the offered papers. She read every page with patient attention, as though reviewing an ordinary household account rather than the formal erasure of her married life. The ballroom became painfully still. Even the fire seemed reluctant to crackle against such unbearable quiet. At last she looked toward Nathaniel. "I understand, Your Grace," she said softly. Her voice carried no accusation, no bitterness, no trembling appeal, only grace. She reached into her gloved hand, removed the magnificent Ashcombe emerald ring, and laid it carefully upon the silver tray beside the signed documents. The emerald flashed once beneath the chandelier before surrendering its brilliance to stillness. Nathaniel's expression remained disciplined, yet his gaze lingered upon her hands. Only he noticed how delicately they trembled after releasing the ring, or how she discreetly folded them together to conceal their weakness from every watching eye. Lady Celeste allowed herself the smallest satisfied smile before masking it behind sympathetic concern. "My dear Duchess," she murmured loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "I pray happier days await you." Eleanor met her eyes without hostility. "I sincerely hope they await us all." The reply, offered with perfect courtesy, unsettled Celeste far more than anger would have done. Formal signatures followed beneath the solicitor's careful supervision. Wax seals were pressed. Witnesses stepped forward. The marriage that had united two ancient houses disappeared into legal language, witnessed by the very society that had celebrated its beginning. No one applauded. No one dared. As the musicians cautiously resumed another waltz, conversation returned in cautious fragments. Some pitied Eleanor's quiet humiliation. Others admired Nathaniel's practicality. Most simply delighted in possessing tomorrow's finest gossip before leaving the ballroom. Nathaniel expected relief. Instead, an unfamiliar heaviness settled within his chest as Eleanor offered one final graceful curtsy. "May your future bring you every peace you seek," she whispered. Before he could answer, she turned away. Her silver skirts disappeared among the dancers like fading moonlight slipping behind winter clouds. Hours later, long before dawn softened the eastern horizon, Eleanor departed Blackthorn Hall through the servants' courtyard. Only her faithful maid accompanied her, loading a single locked trunk into a modest carriage that bore no noble crest. She paused only once to glance back at the towering estate where she had surrendered her name, her dreams, and the fragile hope that silence might someday be understood as sacrifice instead of indifference. Nathaniel watched unseen from the library window, convinced he had finally ended an impossible marriage, yet strangely unable to silence the ache following her departure. The carriage rolled into dense morning fog until only its faint lantern remained visible. Inside, concealed beneath warm blankets, a sleepy little boy opened bright gray eyes remarkably like the Duke's, reached for Eleanor's hand and whispered, "Mama, when may I finally meet Father?" Her composure shattered into silent tears as the carriage vanished forever. Spring arrived across England with tender blossoms and gentler skies, yet no season possessed the power to soften the emptiness that had settled inside Blackthorn Hall. The grand corridors remained as magnificent as ever, adorned with ancestral portraits, polished mahogany, and towering arrangements of fresh lilies, but the estate no longer breathed with quiet warmth. Servants moved carefully through silent rooms, speaking in hushed voices as though disturbing the stillness might awaken memories better left sleeping. Duke Nathaniel Ashcombe had gained the freedom he once believed indispensable, yet every triumph tasted strangely hollow, and every evening concluded before a fire that seemed incapable of driving away the growing chill within his heart. Society applauded his decisive judgment with predictable enthusiasm. Invitations arrived from influential families eager to present accomplished daughters whose beauty and fortunes promised more advantageous futures than his first marriage had supposedly offered. Lady Celeste Whitmore accepted these attentions with elegant confidence, believing time itself had become her ally. She appeared frequently at Blackthorn Hall beneath perfectly respectable pretexts, recommending renovations, arranging charitable gatherings, and gently suggesting that painful chapters deserved permanent closure. Nathaniel thanked her unfailingly, yet each conversation left him inexplicably restless, as though an invisible truth lingered just beyond reach. He found himself wandering through forgotten wings of the estate where Eleanor had once quietly devoted herself to household affairs overlooked by everyone else. The conservatory still flourished because she had insisted every neglected vine deserved another season. The chapel candles continued appearing fresh each Sunday because old habits outlived their mistress. Even the servants unconsciously followed schedules she had established years before. Her presence lingered everywhere except beside him, transforming absence into something almost tangible. One rainy afternoon, Nathaniel entered a long-unused nursery while reviewing inventories of unused chambers. Dust floated through pale sunlight, illuminating faded wallpaper painted with bluebirds and climbing roses. The room should never have existed. According to every official account, no child had ever belonged to the Ashcombe household. Yet a finely carved cradle stood near the window, draped beneath linen carefully preserved against time. Tiny knitted blankets rested inside a cedar chest, accompanied by embroidered cushions bearing delicate initials stitched in silver thread. Nathaniel traced trembling fingers across the graceful letter O without understanding why his pulse suddenly quickened. When he questioned the housekeeper, the elderly woman lowered her eyes with visible discomfort. "Her Grace personally prepared this room several years ago, Your Grace." "For whom?" "I believed. I was not permitted to ask." She excused herself before he could continue, leaving unanswered questions echoing louder than any confession. That evening Nathaniel unlocked old household ledgers Eleanor had meticulously maintained. Between records of charitable donations and estate accounts lay folded receipts from children's physicians practicing in distant counties. There were purchases for infant clothing, medicinal tonics, tiny leather shoes, illustrated storybooks, and carved wooden toys. None had been charged to the household accounts. Every expense had been quietly paid from Eleanor's private inheritance. He searched for explanation. He discovered only mystery. Far away along England's rugged southern coast, Eleanor lived beneath the modest surname Mrs. Ellis within a whitewashed cottage overlooking restless gray seas. The salt wind tangled her chestnut hair as she hung freshly washed linens while laughter drifted across the garden. 3-year-old Oliver chased butterflies among blooming foxgloves with fearless delight, his wooden horse clutched faithfully beneath one small arm. Every smile he offered eased the wounds hidden inside his mother's heart, reminding her why every sacrifice had remained worthwhile despite unbearable loneliness. Each evening she told him gentle stories beside the hearth. "Will father return after his journey?" Oliver asked with innocent hope. "One day," Eleanor answered softly, smoothing his golden curls. "When heaven believes the hour is kind." The promise hurt her more than silence ever could. Oliver accepted it with complete trust, imagining his unseen father as a courageous gentleman crossing mountains and oceans before coming home. He spoke proudly of adventures never lived, while Eleanor concealed tears behind quiet smiles, praying the child would never mistake absence for abandonment. Back at Blackthorn Hall, Nathaniel's unease deepened into obsession. He ordered forgotten trunks opened and neglected storerooms examined. Among Eleanor's carefully packed belongings he discovered a small carved rocking horse, lovingly polished by countless little hands. Burned into its underside were the initials OI. His breath caught. Those letters meant nothing. Yet somehow they meant everything. Lady Celeste found him studying the toy. "Surely such sentimental trifles deserve donation," she suggested lightly. "They belong to a life that never truly existed." Nathaniel looked toward her. "Perhaps," he replied, "or perhaps they belong to a truth no one permitted me to see." For the first time since their acquaintance began, uncertainty flickered across Celeste's composed face before disappearing behind another gracious smile. Days later Nathaniel traveled unexpectedly to London for parliamentary business. Crossing Hyde Park after dusk, he glimpsed a familiar figure stepping from a modest hired carriage outside a church orphanage. Eleanor. She carried baskets filled with bread, blankets, and medicine, greeting every child by name before disappearing inside. Nathaniel instinctively moved forward, then stopped. By the time he reached the entrance, she had vanished through another passage into the crowded streets beyond. Only her lingering fragrance of lavender remained. He questioned the matron, who smiled warmly. "Mrs. Ellis visits every month. The children call her their guardian angel." "Mrs. Ellis?" Nathaniel repeated. "I fear that is all I know." He returned to Blackthorn Hall haunted by questions multiplying faster than answers. Every certainty surrounding his marriage had begun quietly collapsing beneath overlooked details. Late one evening, while autumn rain tapped steadily against stained glass windows, the estate chaplain announced that an elderly village priest had arrived carrying something entrusted to the Duke years before. The frail clergyman stepped into the library, withdrew a sealed ivory envelope from his weathered satchel, and placed it carefully upon Nathaniel's desk. Across its elegant handwriting appeared a single instruction that chilled him completely. "Deliver only if my husband finally begins searching for what he chose to lose." Nathaniel stared at the ivory envelope long after the elderly priest quietly withdrew from the library, leaving only the crackling fireplace and the relentless rhythm of rain against the leaded windows. The elegant handwriting belonged unmistakably to Eleanor, every graceful stroke carrying the quiet restraint that had always defined her. Dust danced through the amber glow of the lamps while shadows stretched across shelves lined with generations of Ashcombe history, yet none of those inherited volumes seemed capable of preparing him for the truth resting beneath his fingertips. For several breathless moments he could not bring himself to break the crimson wax seal, fearing that whatever waited inside would either restore hope or destroy the last fragile certainty he possessed. At last he unfolded the carefully preserved pages. "My dear husband," the letter began, "if these words have reached your hands, then Providence has granted me one final chance to tell you what silence once demanded I conceal." Nathaniel lowered himself into the leather chair as his heartbeat echoed louder than the storm outside. Eleanor wrote not with bitterness, but with heartbreaking tenderness. She confessed that 3 winters earlier, while Nathaniel negotiated vital legislation in London, her carriage had been attacked upon a lonely woodland road by masked riders seeking documents concerning the Ashcombe inheritance. The frightened horses overturned the carriage, leaving her gravely injured and forcing an early labor in the isolated home of a country physician. Their infant son entered the world weak, scarcely breathing, while his exhausted mother hovered between life and death. The physician believed neither would survive until sunrise, yet both endured through stubborn courage and countless prayers whispered by strangers who expected no reward. When Eleanor recovered enough to understand the danger surrounding them, she discovered that the attack had not been random. Rumors spread among loyal servants that enemies of the Ashcombe family believed eliminating the Duke's future heir would weaken generations of influence. The physician urged secrecy above all else. If anyone suspected the child had survived, another attempt might surely follow. Eleanor made an impossible choice before Nathaniel could return. She entrusted the infant to an elderly farming couple who had once served her late father, knowing they would protect him with humble devotion far from aristocratic attention. Nathaniel's hands trembled violently. Oliver. The mysterious initial. The nursery. The blankets. Every forgotten clue suddenly aligned into a single unbearable truth. His son had lived. His wife had carried the burden alone. He continued reading through blurred vision. I wrote to you 6 times, Eleanor confessed. Each letter carried our son's name and the place where he waited safely. None were answered. I believed grief had hardened your heart against us, though I prayed each night I had been mistaken. Nathaniel searched desperately among old memories. No such letters had ever reached him. His breathing grew uneven. Sunrise. She told no one where they were going, only that someone had finally begun searching, and she prayed he would not arrive too late. Someone had ensured they never would. The following morning he summoned every senior servant who had remained at Blackthorn Hall during those years. Most answered honestly, bewildered by his sudden questions. Others recalled only fragments. Finally the former stable master, a man nearing retirement whose loyalty outweighed his fear, requested permission to speak privately. There were letters, Your Grace, he admitted quietly. I carried several from Her Grace to the front entrance myself. What became of them? They never left the estate. Nathaniel's face hardened. Explain. The old servant swallowed heavily. I saw Lady Celeste receive them from the butler whenever messengers arrived. She claimed you had instructed her to manage personal correspondence during parliamentary sessions. I believed she acted with your blessing. Silence engulfed the room. Nathaniel dismissed everyone before rage overwhelmed his composure. He walked alone through the rain-soaked gardens until the cold could no longer cool the fire building within him. Every conversation he had shared with Celeste, every carefully planted suspicion, every subtle remark questioning Eleanor's honesty suddenly revealed itself as part of something far darker than jealousy. Years of misunderstandings had not emerged naturally. They had been cultivated with patient precision. That evening he confronted Lady Celeste in the drawing room. She met his accusation with flawless elegance. You cannot possibly believe every sentimental tale written by a woman desperate to reclaim your affection. My affection? Nathaniel replied quietly. She sought only the chance to tell me I had become a father. Celeste's confident smile faltered. You know nothing of the dangers she imagined. I know someone prevented a husband from learning his child had survived. For several agonizing moments neither spoke. Then Celeste sighed. I merely protected your future from unnecessary complications. Nathaniel stared at her as though seeing a stranger. You protected only your own ambition. Without another word he ordered her immediate departure from Blackthorn Hall pending a formal investigation into every intercepted letter entrusted to her care. After midnight Nathaniel returned to the library carrying the official annulment decree. The parchment seemed strangely lifeless beneath the flickering firelight. He remembered Eleanor standing before hundreds of spectators, surrendering her ring without complaint while carrying knowledge that would have shattered any lesser soul. She had accepted disgrace because exposing their son might have exposed him to those still hunting the Ashcombe bloodline. The realization broke something inside him. He fed the decree into the flames. Wax curled. Ink blackened. The document dissolved into glowing ash. She surrendered her name so our son might keep his life, he whispered into the silent room, his voice raw with remorse. And I called it indifference. Before dawn he departed Blackthorn Hall alone, refusing escorts or ceremony. Guided only by Eleanor's letter and the physician's fading records, he rode through mist-covered villages, quiet valleys, and endless country roads until reaching the modest coastal parish where she had last been seen. Hope battled fear with every mile. At sunset he arrived before the whitewashed cottage described in the letter, only to find shuttered windows and an empty garden swaying gently beneath the sea wind. An elderly neighbor stepped from the adjoining gate, studying the exhausted Duke with sympathetic eyes before speaking words that stole the breath from his lungs. You have missed them by only a few hours, she said softly. Mrs. Ellis left with her little boy before. Nathaniel remained motionless outside the deserted cottage long after the elderly neighbor returned indoors, listening to the restless sea crash against weathered cliffs as though the tide itself mourned every opportunity lost. The salt-laden wind tugged at his coat, carrying away the last illusion that redemption would arrive easily. 4 years he had measured success through estates, influence, and duty, believing control alone could preserve a noble house. Now the vast inheritance behind him seemed insignificant beside the absence of a woman he had wronged and a son whose laughter he had never heard. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Ashcombe understood that love could not be reclaimed by authority. It had to be pursued with humility. He refused to return to Blackthorn Hall. Instead, he followed every fragile thread Eleanor had left behind. The village physician remembered her kindness more vividly than her sorrow. A schoolmistress spoke of a graceful widow called Mrs. Ellis who had anonymously purchased books for children unable to afford them. A blacksmith recalled repairing a tiny wooden horse after a cheerful little boy accidentally broke one of its wheels. An innkeeper remembered a mother who paid another family's supper without revealing her name before quietly disappearing into the rain. Every story described the same gentle courage, and every stranger spoke of Eleanor with affection untouched by titles or wealth. Nathaniel discovered that although she had hidden herself from the aristocracy, she had never hidden her compassion. Each testimony deepened both his admiration and his regret. One evening, exhausted after days on horseback, he unfolded Eleanor's letter once more beneath the glow of a coaching inn's fireplace. Her elegant handwriting seemed almost alive within the dancing light. "If you are searching because loneliness has become inconvenient," she had written, "turn back now. But if you are searching because love has finally become stronger than pride, then perhaps heaven has already forgiven what I still struggle to forget." Nathaniel closed his eyes. "I shall spend the remainder of my life proving the answer," he whispered into the empty room. Meanwhile, Eleanor journeyed north with Oliver through quiet market towns and flowering countryside, avoiding places where influential families might recognize the former Duchess of Ashcombe. She dressed simply, teaching her son that kindness earned greater respect than rank ever could. Oliver greeted strangers with fearless warmth, collecting stories from shepherds, fishermen, and gardeners with equal fascination. His innocent delight reminded Eleanor that despite every hardship, she had preserved the gentleness within him that hatred might easily have stolen. Yet each passing day brought new uncertainty. She had learned through newspapers that Nathaniel had publicly dismissed Lady Celeste from his household while launching an investigation into intercepted correspondence. Rumors spread that England's most respected duke had withdrawn from Parliament, cancelled important engagements, and abandoned every discussion of remarriage. Society mocked his sudden transformation, calling him sentimental, unstable, and bewitched by a wife who had long vanished. Nathaniel ignored every whisper. Instead, he returned to London and requested an audience before influential members of Parliament and several noble families who had witnessed the annulment months earlier. The chamber filled with curious observers expecting another political announcement. Instead, the Duke stood alone before them without prepared notes or practiced diplomacy. "I wronged an honorable woman," he declared, his voice echoing through the solemn hall. "My pride accepted lies because they required less courage than trust. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe deserved my faith, and I rewarded her with public humiliation. I ask no sympathy for myself. I ask only that every falsehood spoken against her name end today." Silence followed. No nobleman of Nathaniel's stature had ever confessed such failure before his peers. By sunset the newspapers carried only one story. The Duke had cleared his former wife's honor before the nation. Far away, Eleanor read those words with trembling hands while seated beside a quiet riverbank where Oliver skipped smooth stones across the water. "He spoke the truth," she whispered. Her faithful maid smiled gently. "Perhaps because he has finally found it." Eleanor folded the newspaper carefully. "The truth alone cannot restore trust." "No," the maid replied softly. "But it may begin the journey." Nathaniel's search resumed with renewed determination. He followed records from village churches, charity houses, and local schools until a traveling artist unknowingly offered the most important clue. While displaying watercolor landscapes at a country fair, the painter mentioned sketching a cheerful little boy who insisted on posing beside a magnificent white horse because he dreamed of owning one someday. "He looked remarkably like you, Your Grace," the artist remarked with a puzzled smile. Nathaniel's heart pounded. "Where?" The painter pointed toward a neighboring county preparing for its annual Spring Blossom Festival. Nathaniel rode without rest. Cherry trees stretched across rolling hills like clouds of pink and ivory, while musicians filled the festival grounds with lively melodies. Children chased ribbons between flower stalls, merchants offered fresh pastries and painted toys, and families laughed beneath fragrant branches swaying in the afternoon breeze. The joyful celebration contrasted painfully with the desperate hope filling Nathaniel's heart as he searched every face passing through the crowd. Then he saw him. A small boy stood beneath a flowering cherry tree, laughing as he tried to lift a colorful kite into the gentle wind. Golden curls danced across his forehead. Bright gray eyes sparkled with fearless curiosity. Nathaniel stopped breathing. Those eyes were his own. Not merely similar. Identical. The child stumbled, and before Eleanor could reach him, Nathaniel instinctively stepped forward, steadying the little boy with careful hands. Oliver looked up without fear, studying the stranger's face with innocent fascination. "Thank you, sir," he said politely. Nathaniel struggled to answer. "You are most welcome." Across the meadow Eleanor froze. Time itself seemed to halt between them. The breeze carried fallen blossoms through the silent space separating husband and wife, scattering pale petals across the grass like forgotten wedding confetti. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Years of grief, misunderstanding, sacrifice, and longing rested within that impossible silence. Oliver glanced from his mother to the unfamiliar gentleman whose eyes glistened with unshed tears. Then, with perfect innocence, he slipped his small hand into Nathaniel's trembling fingers and looked back toward Eleanor. "Mama," he asked softly, "is the gentleman crying because he already knows us?" Eleanor's composure shattered as Nathaniel realized with overwhelming certainty that destiny had finally placed his family within reach, but whether they would ever become his again remained a question only her wounded heart could answer. The festival seemed to fall into reverent silence around them, though music still drifted across the meadow and children continued laughing beneath the flowering cherry trees. Nathaniel could hear nothing except the unsteady rhythm of his own heartbeat. Oliver's tiny hand rested trustingly within his, unaware that the trembling gentleman before him had imagined this moment 1,000 impossible times during sleepless nights. Eleanor stood only a few paces away, her eyes shining with restrained emotion, yet the invisible distance between them still felt greater than every mile Nathaniel had crossed in search of her. He slowly released Oliver's hand and did something no Duke of Ashcombe had ever been expected to do. He knelt. Not before a monarch. Not before Parliament. Before the family he had failed. He lowered his gaze, refusing to claim the authority his title afforded him. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I have not come to demand forgiveness. I have not come to reclaim rights that my own blindness forfeited. I have come to ask permission." Her breath caught. Permission for what? Permission to know the little boy whose first smile I never witnessed. Permission to earn the trust of the woman whose silence protected us both while my pride condemned her. If there is any place for me in your lives, let it be one I deserve rather than inherit. No one nearby understood the conversation, yet something in Nathaniel's humility caused strangers to instinctively look away, granting the family a fragile island of privacy amid the celebration. Oliver looked curiously at his mother. "Mama," he whispered, "why is the gentleman sad?" Eleanor struggled to steady her voice. "Because sometimes good people make painful mistakes." Oliver frowned thoughtfully. "Did someone forgive him?" Nathaniel's eyes filled. "Not yet," he answered honestly. The child considered those words with the uncomplicated wisdom only innocence possesses. "My teacher says saying sorry means you want to do better tomorrow." Nathaniel smiled through tears. "Your teacher is a very wise person." Oliver reached into the small satchel hanging across his shoulder and carefully withdrew the little carved wooden horse that had accompanied him since infancy. Time had softened its edges, and one repaired wheel still bore the careful craftsmanship of the village blacksmith. The little boy studied it for a moment before placing it gently into Nathaniel's open palm. "You look like you need a friend," Oliver said. Nathaniel stared at the toy. Years earlier he had carved that tiny horse himself during a quiet winter evening while imagining the child he hoped might someday race through Blackthorn Hall. He had hidden it inside Eleanor's writing desk as a playful surprise before leaving for London, believing they had years ahead to build their family together. She had kept it. She had given it to their son. His composure finally broke. He gathered the little horse against his chest as though it were made of priceless gold, tears falling freely onto weathered wood polished by Oliver's loving hands. "I made this for you," he whispered. Oliver blinked with surprise. "You did?" Nathaniel nodded. "Long before I knew how desperately I would wish to meet you." The little boy stepped forward without hesitation and wrapped his small arms around Nathaniel's neck. The embrace lasted only moments. Yet it restored years that grief had stolen. Eleanor turned away, unable to hide the tears streaming down her face. Nathaniel rose slowly, still holding Oliver close before gently setting him back upon the grass. "I owe you the truth, Eleanor said at last. They walked together beneath the cherry blossoms while Oliver chased drifting petals nearby under the watchful eyes of Eleanor's faithful maid. I loved you from the day we married, Eleanor confessed quietly, even when you believed my silence meant indifference. But after the attack, every physician begged me to keep Oliver hidden. Your enemies believed our child had died. If they discovered otherwise, they would have tried again. Nathaniel listened without interruption. I wrote to you until I no longer believed my letters reached your hands. Every unanswered silence convinced me that either fate or your heart had closed the door between us. My heart never closed, Nathaniel replied. It was blinded. He told her everything. The intercepted letters. The servant's confessions. Celeste's deception. The public apology before Parliament. The burning of the annulment decree. The endless search through villages and churches. The stories of kindness she had left behind. I discovered your life by listening to strangers describe the woman I should have understood myself, he admitted. Every mile taught me that love cannot survive where pride refuses to listen. Eleanor closed her eyes. I wanted to hate you. Did you? No. She smiled sadly. That was always the hardest part. Nathaniel reached toward her but stopped before touching her hand. I shall never again assume silence means absence of love. This time Eleanor bridged the remaining distance herself. She placed her hand within his. Not because society expected reconciliation. Because hope quietly asked for another chance. Months later they returned together to Blackthorn Hall, not as prisoners of reputation but as partners who had chosen each other freely. News of their reconciliation spread throughout England, inspiring astonishment among those who had celebrated their separation. Nathaniel formally petitioned the courts to nullify the annulment, presenting overwhelming evidence of fraud surrounding the intercepted correspondence. The judges unanimously restored their marriage, declaring Eleanor's honor had never deserved question. Lady Celeste faced public disgrace after the investigation exposed years of calculated manipulation. Families who had once welcomed her eagerly now closed their doors, not because revenge delighted Nathaniel, but because truth had finally overtaken deception. Blackthorn Hall itself slowly transformed. The abandoned nursery filled with laughter. Sunlight replaced silence. Portraits once admired only for noble ancestry now watched a little boy race joyfully through corridors that had waited years to know his footsteps. Nathaniel and Eleanor established the Ashcombe House of Mercy in memory of those who had protected Oliver when power could not. The orphanage and hospital welcomed abandoned children, widowed mothers, and struggling families regardless of birth or fortune. Eleanor personally oversaw every detail, greeting each visitor with the same quiet grace that had carried her through suffering without surrendering compassion. Nathaniel devoted part of the estate to schools where laborers' children studied beside the sons and daughters of merchants, believing that character deserved greater inheritance than privilege alone. Oliver grew surrounded not merely by wealth but by kindness. He became known throughout the county for insisting every festival include children from nearby villages, declaring celebrations belonged to everyone willing to smile. Years passed. Winter returned once more to Blackthorn Hall. The great ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers exactly as it had on the evening their marriage had seemed to end forever. Yet nothing else remained the same. There were no poisonous whispers. No watchful curiosity. No cruel anticipation of scandal. Only music, candlelight, and grateful hearts. Nathaniel offered Eleanor his hand in the center of the ballroom. May I have this dance, my Duchess? She smiled with the warmth he had once believed lost forever. You never needed to ask. I do now. She looked at him curiously. Why? Because love freely chosen is infinitely more precious than love merely promised. They began to dance. Nearby, Oliver laughed as he chased snowflakes drifting through the open terrace doors before racing back inside to tug gently upon his father's sleeve. Father, he called proudly, tasting the word that had once existed only in dreams, come see how beautiful the snow is. Nathaniel glanced toward Eleanor. For a moment neither spoke. Years earlier she had surrendered her title to protect their son. Now the child they had fought so hard to save stood between them, not as a reminder of old wounds, but as living proof that truth, patience, and forgiveness could rebuild what pride had nearly destroyed. Nathaniel kissed Eleanor's hand with quiet reverence. The greatest honor I have ever carried was never becoming Duke, he said softly. It was the day you allowed me to become your husband again, and his father. Eleanor rested her forehead gently against his. And the name we chose together, she whispered, watching Oliver laugh beneath the golden lights, was never Ashcombe. Nathaniel looked at her with quiet wonder. She smiled through joyful tears. It was family. Outside, fresh snow-covered Blackthorn Hall in a blanket of pure white, not erasing the past but blessing it with a new beginning. Within those ancient walls, where gossip had once destroyed trust and silence had hidden unimaginable sacrifice, laughter now echoed without fear. Love had not triumphed because fate had been kind, but because two wounded hearts had finally found the courage to tell the truth, forgive the unforgivable, and choose each other every single day thereafter.